Mhm. So this is AM/PM 2, Advanced Macro Policy Modeling 2, which is one of the two modules that level one GFS students must master. In fact, now pre-GFS students have to master it and be tested on it before they enter formally the GFS level one testing, which is much more like a dynamic learning environment. So these lectures are meant to allow people to go through at their own speed. Today is going to be very practical at the beginning, understanding stock flow dynamics and steady states. And then we're going to move on to the global integrated monetary fiscal model, and we're going to talk about different fiscal rules as well as fiscal multipliers. So there's going to be a ton of information there that is going to be very useful for practitioners interested in fiscal policy rules, as well as macroeconomists that are interested in multipliers and so on. So we'll start off by looking at some basic relationships and why it's important to understand the insights of steady states and stock flow dynamics, even if one is simply just an applied macroeconomist and he wants to understand a bit of the implications of stock flow relationships and so on. And so we're going to start off actually with the saving rate. And it's going to, you're going to see here that if you look at the trend in private saving rates and inflation, and if you look at econometricians that have modeled this, they always find that there's a relationship between inflation and the saving rate. Well, after we go through some simple math here, um, we are going to see that this is just a characterization um, of neutrality. That when people care about real things, there will be inflation premium built into things like saving rates and government saving rates and private saving rates and virtually all saving rates. And so this is just purely a reflection of real things being determined by real things in the long run, and so on. Now, very basic thing is, understanding what a steady state is. And in this case, what we're going to do is look at a pretty standard looking inflation equation that basically has pi, the inflation rate, a linear combination of a lead and a lag, in this case, illustratively with weights of 0.5, and the output gap y plus some shock. So when we think of that equation system, we would call that a dynamic equation because it has these leads is pi t plus 1 and these lags is pi t minus 1 in the equation. And when we think of a steady state, um, it's not very complicated. We just think of a, a solution for the economy where things are on what we would describe as a balanced growth path, where everything's constant. So inflation's constant, which means that pi t is equal to pi t plus 1, and pi t is equal to pi t minus 1. So we can just derive what we call the steady state analog equations simply by just eliminating all the superscripts and the subscripts from the dynamic equation. So you can see that when we do that, because that adding up restriction on the lead and the lag the fact that the parameters sum to 1, 0.5, and 0.5 is equal to 1. Because of that, those terms cancel out if there is no shock, epsilon pi t. That's the shock in the equation. So there's no shock in the steady state. That's why it's steady. Then we have an equation that boils down to 0.5 times the output gap is equal to 0. And so that implies that this model must have a steady state, if it has one at all. In other words, subject to the condition that inflation is constant, implies that the output gap has to be 0 to be consistent with that condition that inflation is equal to a constant. So that's just an example of a steady state. In these gigantic, humongous, nonlinear models that I developed at the International Monetary Fund. So these are multi-country, either DSGE models or structural models or semi-structural models. Because of the multi-country nature, and because of the non-linearities, it's impossible to actually derive a functional form where you can solve exactly like a closed form solution to those models. You have to derive the steady state solution to them from solving a nonlinear system of equations. So it's effectively exactly this logic that we have on the screen here. That applies not just one equation, but it can apply to models that have thousands of equations, like the equations at the IMF, big multi-country models. We're going to show you one of them, GIMP here in a bit here. Now, the steady state analog model can be really useful because one can study the comparative statics. In other words, what happens in the long run if something like government debt changes permanently. We can also use them to impose terminal conditions on models. So these dynamic models, we can think of as simply solving a 2-point boundary problem where the economy starts off by being tied to some initial condition, and it's going to some steady state. And so at the very end of the time period that we're trying to solve the model, we can impose that steady state, or we can impose a condition that would be like a steady state. Now, we're going to be spending a lot of time on fiscal policy. And so we're going to start off with all the wonderful insights that one can get from just looking at the steady state conditions imposed on a simple fiscal set of accounts. And so what do I mean by that? Well, let's start off with the basic identity that the change in the level of debt is equal to the deficit. So we're going to call deficit, and we're call big D debt. Okay, so this is just an identity that basically we're going to define the deficit to be equal to the change in the debt. Now, it's quite amazing at how such a simple thing like that can have such powerful insights about how to think about fiscal rules and so on. Because when one has potential growth in the economy, or if it's declining, potential could be declining as well, and one has inflation, it means that nominal GDP is going to be growing over time. And that means that to have a steady state, all the nominal variables in the system have to be growing at the same rate as nominal GDP. So we're going to define nominal GDP as YN, and then we'll define now the deficit to GDP ratio, or DEF, divided by YN. So that's going to be the deficit to GDP ratio. And so we can see that from that identity that we had on the previous slide, it's just going to be equal to the debt to GDP ratio minus the debt last period divided by the GDP level today. Now, what we can do here, and you'll see this a lot in theory models like GIMP or the global economy model or multi-mod, or virtually all the models that I've built, starting with the models that I built in at the Bank of Canada in the early 1990s, is using this idea of a gross growth rate. Now, it's going to turn out when you think in terms of gross growth rates, it's going to make the math a lot easier in these models, and it'll be a bit obvious, I think, for that once we go through the examples we're going to go through. But let's think of the gross growth rate, and instead of thinking in terms of percent changes, we're going to think about everything as ratios of what the level is today. So that would be Y and T, and what the level was yesterday. Okay, so 1% growth in big G terms would be 1.01. Okay, so 1.01, as opposed to 1%. Now that's going to turn out to be really nice. Of course, little gyn, what we normally think of as a growth rate, would just be that big GYN minus 1. So it would be 0.01. And of course, we would normally convert that into percent by multiplying it by 100. Okay, but that's how you go from the big GYN to little GYN. And we're going to find out that's going to be really, really helpful, because all nominal variables have to be growing again at GYN. So that's going to be true of the nominal GDP, it's going to be true of the deficit, and it's going to be true of the stock of debt. Well, that means that we can then plug that in. So if dt over dt minus 1 is equal to GYN in the steady state, that's going to imply that the lagged value of dt minus 1 is just going to be dt divided by GYN. So you see that anything that's lagged one period, it's just going to be what it is next period divided by GYN. Okay, and now one can see why the math is going to be much, much easier. So now that we have that condition, we can go down and look at our deficit equation, which is dt over dt minus 1. Well, we can just say, well, that's just equal to dt minus, again, big dt divided by GYN, because we have to back it up one period's growth rate to get it back to dt minus 1. Now, there you go. Now we have an equation that says the deficit is equal to the debt times big GYN minus 1. Remember, in this case, if GYN was equal to 1% or 1.01, then it would basically be 0.01 divided by 1.01. That's what this expression would be right here. And so we can see that basically the deficit to debt ratio is basically just equal to the growth rate of the economy. Okay, so again, the big GYN, if it was 1.01, minus 1 would be 0.01. And then, of course, it's just scaled by 1.01 in the denominator. So it's approximately just what we normally think about as the growth rate Now, of course, nominal GDP we can decompose into inflation. And so we're going to call big pi should be PT divided by PT minus one. There's an error on the screen right here. And GY is equal to YT over YT minus one. So we can decompose nominal GDP into inflation, which in the steady state we'll assume is equal to the target. Assume that the central bank is dominant in determining the long run inflation rate. And then, of course, potential growth. So we just obviously can take our big GYN, and in this case, it just becomes multiplicative. So we'll have our big GY times our big pi. Okay, and so it's makes the math really easily. Now, I'm going to just give you some examples. These are actually relevant for the United States right now. And the reason is that the United States has a inflation target of 2%. So that's like the big pi equal to 1.02. And potential growth has recently, CBO has had it at about 1.7, 1.8, but with the recent data over the last year or so, income combined with, for example, other things going on that introduction of labor saving devices that are expected to affect productivity over the next few years. We are revising up potential growth to about 2%. So these numbers are actually quite plausible. And so that would be a sustainable rate of nominal GDP growth of 4%, or in gross growth rates 1.0404 if one wanted to be that exact. And so that implies that basically if the government debt to GDP ratio, which is around 100%, okay, so that would imply that to keep government debt at 100%, so that's the debt D to YN ratio here. If that was equal to 100, then that would imply, because GYN, little GYN, remember, is big GYN minus 1. And so that number would be 0.04 divided by 1.04. So let's just assume that's approximately 0.04 or 4%, which means that if you had a debt to GDP ratio of 100%, then your deficit to GDP ratio would have to be 4%. So just 4% times the 100%. Now it's a little bit smaller than that again, because you have to divide by the 1 plus the 4% in the denominator. Okay, but approximately 4%. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if you didn't want, if you thought that that debt to GDP ratio was too high, 100%, you thought that a safe level of government debt was maybe 50%, okay, then, well, again, if D over Y is 50% and your nominal growth rate, sustainable nominal growth rate is 4%, so 4% times 50 would be 2%. And so if you just came up with an incredibly simple rule, okay, that basically you weren't ever going to allow your deficit to rise above 2% okay, then that would be a nice, very extremely simple rule, because it would be associated with the debt to GDP ratio rising from its current level of about 100% gradually down to 50%, and then 50% would be the upper limit. So just so a very, very simple rule for the United States, something that could be explained to people and would be would be intelligible. It would just say, I'm not going to run a deficit ever bigger than 2%. And if my initial debt to GDP ratio was 100%, okay, running such a policy would eventually result in the debt to GDP ratio falling below 50%. Okay. 50% would be the maximum value if you committed to having a deficit of 2%. So the only thing I'm doing here is I'm just going, if the debt, if this thing is a maximum of 2%, okay, so 2%, okay, that's what my maximum or my deficit to GDP ratio is. And if my nominal GDP growth is 4%, okay, so 0.04, okay, well, that means that that my debt to GDP ratio is going to be equal to 50%. Okay, so that's what if I kept my deficit exactly at 2% forever, okay, then this steady state relationship, given that growth is 0.4%, I'm going to put in, call it 0.044%. Okay, and so that relationship is quite cute because it means that once you know the deficit to GDP ratio in the long run, you'll also know what the debt to GDP ratio is in the long run. And so obviously, if I just said 2% deficit was my maximum, then that would be that the maximum amount of debt that I would eventually have would be 50%. So that's a really cool relationship. Everybody in the GFS needs to understand that, needs to be able to do all those calculations in their head, because when they're looking at model results or they're thinking about fiscal policy, they need to understand those things. Now, we can also, so here's just a little table with those calculations. So if the deficit to GDP ratio is equal to again 4% times the debt to GDP ratio, okay. So again, the 4% is 2% inflation and 2% growth. You can see that you can just read off if the debt to GDP ratio is 100%, then the deficit GDP ratio is around 4%, a little bit lower than 4% again because of the 1.04 in the denominator. Okay, so that's a really good little thing for you to remember. Now, one can also think about it, and this is going to be maybe even more profound, but we can also take the deficit and separate it into the primary deficit and interest payments. Interest payments, we're just going to model in the simplest possible case where we have a debt instrument that rolls over each period. And so then the interest payments would be the interest rate, RNT, times the lagged value of debt. We're going to think of the real interest rate as being just the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. So these are just reviewing what we talked about before about imposing a steady state condition. So now, again, we're starting off with the deficit is equal to the change in the debt. Deficit is also just decomposed into the primary deficit and interest payments. Primary deficit is the difference between government expenditures and tax revenues. Okay, so again, we could just expand those two things, and we end up with the change in debt is equal to the deficit, primary deficit, plus the interest payments. We know that the interest payments are equal to Rn times debt T minus 1. And so now we can get a very nice little expression for the debt, the primary deficit, and the lag debt, which of course we know that all variables in the steady state have to be growing at nominal GDP. So we can take any nominal variable, and then if there's a lag, divide it by nominal GDP and or the growth rate of nominal GDP in the steady state. And so now we have a really nice relationship where we have the primary deficit to GDP ratio is equal to the interest rate minus the growth rate of the economy. And this is what we call the non-Ponzi game condition, because if that interest rate is above the growth rate of the economy, then we can see that the primary deficit has to respond, has to be endogenous. So this is the analog in the world of monetary policy. We talk about the interest rate having to be endogenous, and what the Bank of England does and other non-FS central banks when they do exogenous interest rate forecasts, that should be illegal, because the fundamental role of the central bank should be to adjust that instrument to achieve their inflation objectives. Same story here, except instead of it being the interest rate, it's the primary balance or the primary deficit that needs to be adjusted if the interest rate is above the growth rate of the economy to stabilize the debt process. So just in the monetary policy world, the interest rate has to be endogenous to anchor the system. In the fiscal policy world, the primary balance or the primary surplus or the deficit, depending on how you want to define it, it has to adjust. Otherwise, your interest payments will become unstable if the interest rate is above the growth rate of the economy. Now, this is very interesting because if the interest rate is above the growth rate of the economy, we can see that the sign switches. And so if an economy has lots of debt, like the United States, if they have 100% debt to GDP ratio, then if the effective interest rate on that debt were 6%, RN would be equal to 6 in this case. And if the growth rate of the economy was to be 4%, so we would have RN 6 minus 4, which would be 2. But remember, the sign switches. And that means that the government would have to run a primary surplus of 2% of GDP to stabilize the debt at 100% of GDP. Now, what does that mean? It means that hold on to your wallets, because it means that with primary deficits in the 2 to 3% range, as far as we can see, that is consistent with an explosive debt to GDP ratio. Now, the question is, what would it take to stabilize that explosive debt profile? And the answer is 2%. You'd have to run a primary surplus of 2% of GDP. Well, we're at about a 2 to 3% deficit. That would mean a 5 percentage point increase in taxes. Okay, if one was to keep the profile for expenditures fixed, or it would mean some combination of a large increase in taxes and large cut in expenditures, where the expenditure to GDP ratio should also be cut by 5%, 5 percentage points of GDP. So higher taxes, lower expenditures, pain. If Larry Summers is correct, that we are in a high interest rate world, this calculation has some pretty profound implications. Okay, so this is an example where if the debt to GDP ratio is 100%, how the primary deficit has to be minus 1% in this case. Now, this is the case for the interest rate. equal to 5%. So that's an intermediate case. The example that I used was 6%. Quite easy. Could be 5%, could be 6%. How would you get 6%? One, if fiscal policy was viewed as being unsustainable, and if fiscal policy, according to the work of HICAS, Hamid Faruqi, and I, the idea is that increases in world government debt has increased the world real interest rate. So if you believe the world real interest rate now is about 2%, so that would be higher than what the Fed currently assumes, but I think we can count on them to be revising it up over the next year or so. So you'd have a 2% real rate. That would be a short-term real rate, like the Fed funds rate, for example, plus 2% inflation. And so 2 plus 2 is 4. And then a term premium of 200 basis points. So that's how it would take us up to 6%. Now, in this example right here, it only goes up to 5%. So you can see that you'd only need a 1% primary surplus to stabilize the debt at 100%. So the same logic, math, is going to work for looking at current accounts and net foreign asset positions, or you can define it as current account deficits and net foreign liability positions. But in this case, we'll think of the current account as being a balance. Okay, so a positive value would be a surplus and negative value would be a deficit. And so that's going to be equal to the change in net foreign assets. Again, you employ exactly the same tricks that we just did for the deficit. We can then separate the current account balance into the trade balance and interest payments on the stock and net foreign assets. And now we can do the same thing and get a nice relationship between the current account to GDP ratio and the primary trade balance. And so the same deal works that if you're a debtor country and you're borrowing from the rest of the world, you're going to have to run a current account deficit to keep that stock of debt constant as a share of GDP. And it means that, if you're a debtor, your interest payments to foreigners are going to be high. And as a result of that, you'll have to run a trade surplus in this case, just like the government had to run a government surplus. The economy is going to have to run a trade surplus. In other words, you're going to have to give more goods to foreigners than you get back, effectively, to pay the interest obligations on your debt. So exactly the same story logic holds. If the interest rate's higher than the growth rate of the economy, if RN's greater than the growth rate of nominal GDP, then you have to run a trade surplus in the steady state to finance the interest obligations on your debt. Or in this case, it's written as a trade balance and net foreign asset position. So that's important because we can draw implications from it that if you have a country that increases government deficits, and if that builds up into high levels of government debt, then we know that if the world is non-Ricardian, okay, so what does that mean? It means that if a government runs a deficit, particularly in a smaller country where you can borrow and lend at an unchanged interest rate from the rest of the world. So let's consider an increase in government debt that's small, like maybe 10 percentage points of GDP. Something small enough where you wouldn't have an increase in the country risk premium. Well, if the world is non-Ricardian, it means that net foreign liabilities, you're basically just going to be borrowing from foreigners. So your net foreign liabilities, if you can borrow and lend at an unchanged interest rate from the rest of the world, is also going to rise by approximately 10 percentage points, the same amount as government debt increased. And so we know from that, okay, that the current account balance will have to be lower to be consistent to keep the economy in this debt situation. Uh, Again, because of nominal growth. And it means that there's going to have to be a trade balance surplus in this case of in these examples of these countries, 0.2 percentage points of GDP. And therefore we know that under the assumption that demand curves slope down and supply curves slope up, we know that the real exchange rate in the long run would have to depreciate by some amount. In this case, depends on the elasticities of demand and supply to ensure that trade balance and to stabilize the net foreign asset process. So that is a really neat thing, especially if you're playing around with models that have stock flow relationships in them, that you have a good idea about what is pinning down the long run, and therefore, since the long run is connected to the medium run, and then of course, since the medium run is connected to the short run as well. So it's going to turn out that in these models that have stock flow relationships which are absolutely necessary, you have to have these kinds of relationships to pin down things like the long run real exchange rate, the long run net foreign asset position, and so on. So going through this, a little example where you understand stock flow relationships, I think is absolutely essential. They're also useful for any process, any capital accumulation process. For example, anything like private sector capital or housing or consumer durables and so on. And so you can go through the same type of process and get a lot of insights out of basically a very simple model that has a desired stock of either capital or housing or whatever. So in this case, what we're going to do is just going to start off with what we call the perpetual inventory method, where we assume that capital just depreciates at some fixed rate delta. And so it just says that the change in the capital stock is equal to gross investment minus depreciation. And so this idea that the delta of your capital stock depreciates each period allows us to write down this equation, which is used actually to construct capital stock data in a lot of countries. You better be careful about this. Most people don't know this, but most of the estimates of the capital stock are pretty bogus. There actually are no historical data on the capital stock. There's somebody making up capital stock data, effectively finding the depreciation rate that prevents the capital output ratio from either exploding or imploding. So, but it's very, very useful as a as a as a little model for thinking through lots of uh, interesting questions, like what's going on with China right now. So China had a very high investment to GDP ratio, like um, like just in the housing sector alone, it was like about a quarter for the entire economy got up to, around 50%. So an investment to GDP ratio of that magnitude means that you're developing the capital stock. Now, the problem in China, of course, is that capital stock wasn't very productive, as it turned out. Uh, there's obviously lots and lots of distortions about where that capital was being allocated and so on. But we've never seen in the history a situation where the investment GDP ratio has been so high and the economy managed to achieve a smooth landing. And the reason is that when the investment GDP ratio gets that high and you have growth so dependent on investment, well, once you achieve a particular level of capital, it means that the investment GDP ratio has to come down just to the rate to finance depreciation, as well as just to deal with the a little bit of growth in the economy. So you can do the same mathematical transformations that we did earlier, simply by defining variables like yt minus one and kt minus one as taking yt and dividing by the gross growth rate and so on. And when you do that, you develop these really nice relationships between flows, investment flows, and the capital stock. And so you can see in the bottom, investment is just equal to the capital stock plus this growth rate of the real economy minus the depreciation rate. And so here is the expression where we basically just have the growth rate of the economy. So again, if that's 2%, delta, what would delta be for things like the housing capital stock? It would be a number like maybe 2%. That would be the depreciation rate on housing. So you'd have 2%, 2%, growth 2%. So you'd have 4%. So the investment capital ratio would be 4%. Here's an example for housing. Again, no, delta is 2%, and the growth rate of the real economy is 3%. And so this just suggests that in this case, the investment to GDP ratio in this case would just be 5%, the sum of the depreciation rate plus the growth rate. Or one can think about it the other way around. One can think about it as what's the flow level of investment that you might think is a steady state value. And then you could calculate what the implied stock to GDP ratio is. Is really interesting because if you go back to the global financial crisis, here you're looking at the residential investment GDP ratio, and you can see it was a number like about 5%. So you see the green line. And what happened is potential growth was revised down by well over a percentage point. People's expectations were too optimistic before the global financial crisis. This is a thing about all crises, that people were too optimistic about the future growth fundamentals of the economy. And of course, in that one, there was a massive underpricing of risk. So this just is showing you that if you just take that very simple calculation about how much the investment to GDP ratio could shift down because of a 1.2 percentage point decline in potential growth, and you can see that it can account for quite a bit of the actual decline in the actual investment to GDP ratio. These are just some estimates of depreciation rates for different types of durables. So if you want to think about, automobiles or uh, or furniture, whatever. For example, during COVID, there was a big shift to home production. And so one can think of that as a big level shift in the desired stock of particular types of durables and so on. And so that can be really fun because that can allow you to look at the national accounts and all those different expenditure categories that are classified as durables and have some idea about how long it should take to build up this higher stock of desired durables for those categories that you think that were affected. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that you had fun dealing with uh, the the incredible insights that one could get out of basically just taking some identities and imposing some steady state conditions on them to get some insights that maybe not everybody is aware of when they look at data. This is a really important foundation because a lot of the early macro work was based on Mundell Fleming and the Dornbush overshooting model and so on. And a lot of our intuition is still based on those models, but those models don't have stocks and flows. A lot of the recent models, unfortunately, models based on infinite horizon representative agent models, they don't have any of this stuff in them as well. They're absolutely essential. They should be in a good macroeconomic toolkit for understanding many things that are happening in real world economy these days.